everyone, my name is Anna and welcome back to another video for this channel of Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's Torah theme, we are going to be analyzing chapters 28 and 29 of the book of Exodus. The title of today's video is Clothed in Holiness to Serve. Before we begin to analyze these chapters, I want to give a little short summary of what we learned in the past video, where we learned that the Eternal gave Moses the instruction about raising the Mishkan, that although in that time this place was the indicated one to give an earthly service to the Creator, but we learned that today in our days, we take these teachings to serve the Father with a heavenly focus. And as we have studied, or as we learned in the past video, each element that was inside the Mishkan has a representation of the believers in the Messiah that make up the habitation of the Eternal. Since let's remember that we are temples of His presence. We are those living stones of the true temple, which is not made by hands. And in this way is that we can offer our gifts and our talents for the service of the Creator. We also learned that we are called to be in unity like the curtains of the Mishkan that built each other up, where Yeshua is the cornerstone of this great spiritual house, and also that He is the mediator that allows us to approach the Father freely, since the veil of separation was broken through His delivery in the wood. And with this short summary, of the past chapters, today we will continue studying about these same instructions. But in this case, it is specifically addressed more to Aaron and his sons, who we're going to see that they are a figure of the true ministry that the Eternal had prepared. And chapter 28 begins with the call that the Eternal makes, to Aaron and his sons, who are Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. The Eternal calls them to appear before Him because He wanted them to be His ministers. We are going to see later on that the Eternal commands them to make sacred garments, and for these garments, they were going to summon all the wise men and people to whom the Eternal gave understanding to carry out this type of work. Since let's remember that these garments had to be made of exquisite to give them honor and splendor, because let us remember that these people would be consecrated to the Almighty at all times. We are going to see that the ministers were going to fulfill a function of mediators before the Eternal, so that through them the people could approach the Father without obstacles. Here we see a shadow and a figure of the Messiah, who is our great minister, who was clothed with majesty and entered the true sanctuary. He came to be that mediator who removes sin and allows us to now get closer to the Eternal Father. As we read in Hebrews 9:24, that says, "For the Messiah has entered, not into holy places made by hands, or made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of Elohim on our behalf." Also, through Yeshua's delivery, believers have been constituted a kingdom of ministers, that we have also been consecrated to dedicate ourselves to serving the Eternal, as it says, or as we can read in 1 Peter 2:5, You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to Elohim through the Messiah. And we can see here that we have received a very important call that we must take very seriously, that we have the responsibility to offer the Eternal a service with excellence and truth, taking care not to disgrade the garments that we have received through Yeshua, who has allowed us to be free from the eternal condemnation, so that we can now focus our attention not on us, but on obeying the Father, putting His instruction into action. And it is necessary that we be preserving in it every day. And just because we are ministers does not mean that we have everything earned. We cannot fall into a state of excessive confidence, because as Paul says, he who thinks he is firm, see that he does not fall. We will even be able to see later on that this same thing happens to the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, where we're going to see that despite the fact that they were consecrated along with their father and brothers, they did not remain in absolute obedience to the Eternal. They wanted to serve Him in their own way, offering strange fire, and that is why they died. This example exhorts us to take care of our salvation with fear and trembling, so as not to lose our consecration. The Messiah Himself even spoke about this in the parable of the 10 virgins, where we see that they all had the same call. They all knew that their husband was going to come. But we can see in this parable that 5 of them were prudent. They prepared themselves. They waited for their husband in holiness, engaging in good works. But on the other hand, the other 5 of these 10 virgins, they were foolish. They were not attentive, and they ran out of oil, which represents the divine presence. And when the husband returned, when he came, they were not ready, and the door was closed on them. In this parable of the 10 virgins, it shows us, and it teaches us that we cannot fall asleep on the path of faith, but that we must continue towards our goal, make an effort every day that we live, not letting ourselves be overcome by the evil that exists in this world, not letting our carnal desires take over us, but rather move towards our promise. And while we move forward, we also should try to bless the lives of others, of those who want to be blessed. As ministers, we must give a good testimony to bring those souls closer to the Creator. And well, with this short introduction, let's begin reading verses 4 to 6 of chapter 28 that say, "These are the garments that they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a coat, a checker work, a turban, and a sash. They shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as priests. They shall receive gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen. And they shall make the ephod of gold, of blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns of fine twined linen, skillfully worked." And as we have just read, we see here that these garments, or these sacred garments, were going to be made for the great minister, or for Aaron and his sons. And in them, we not only can we read what they had to be made out of, but we can also see allusions to our Messiah. For example, each color of the ephod has a representation. Blue has a representation of the heavenly, fine linen represents holiness, gold represents divinity, and purple represents royalty. As I had already mentioned, each of these elements make an allusion to the Messiah, since he descended from heavenly places in holiness, clothed in the divine presence, constituting a mediator for a new covenant by the shedding of his blood, and currently reigns bearing the same that is above all name. In verses 7 through 12, it says, "It shall have 2 shoulder pieces attached to its 2 edges, so that it may be joined together. And the skillfully woven band on it shall be made like it, and be of one piece with it, of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen. You shall take 2 onyx stones, and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 of their names on the one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 on the other stone, in the order of their birth. As a jeweler engraves signets, so shall you engrave the 2 stones with the names of the 2 sons of Israel. You shall enclose them in settings of gold filigree, and you shall set the 2 stones on the shoulder pieces of the ephod as stones of remembrance for the sons of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Eternal, and his 2 shoulders for remembrance." In these verses, we see another figure of the Messiah, because just as Aaron had to carry the names of each tribe on his shoulders, so did the Messiah carry the people of Israel on him, because as we know, he carried their sins, their ailments, and not only them, but also us who come from other nations, but who have been grafted into that people. Yeshua gave himself up to give us redemption, and he has made us partakers of the divine presence, which represents the gold that covers the stones. In Isaiah 53 verse 5 through 8, we can read that it talks about the delivery of Yeshua. It says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that brought us peace, and with his wounds we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people." We can see in these verses that the Eternal also commanded to make golden settings and 2 chains of pure gold, which should be shaped into braided cords, and then the braided chains should be placed in the settings. In addition, he also ordered the pectoral of judgment to be made, which must be the work of an artisan. Like the work of the ephod, it would be made of gold, blue, purple, and twine of fine linen, square, double, 1 span long and 1 span wide, and they had to set it in gemstone settings. We can also see that it is mentioned that 4 rows of stone were going to be made, and all these elements that were going to be used for these 4 rows would be mounted in golden settings, and these stones will be according to the names of the children of Israel. 12 will be in total, 1 for each tribe, or 12 tribe for the 12 tribes in total. And they were going to make engravings like a seal. One aspect that draws my attention is the pectoral of judgment that made up all these stones. This pectoral constitutes what the Eternal would define about the 12 tribes of Israel represented in the stones, which will later on be redeemed by the Messiah, who, just as Aaron, carried them on his heart, and did not come to deliver them from a physical enemy, but from the power of darkness and from what really binds, enslaves, and distances from the eternal, which is the sin. This breastplate would give that verdict that the Eternal wanted to implement on every occasion on the tribes of Israel. As it says in Romans 6, verse 17 and 18, but thanks to Elohim that you were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin have become slaves of righteousness. Now, as servants of justice, we cannot fall back into slavery, but remain in the Messiah, moving away from false doctrines, from the religions, and offering the Father a true service in spirit and in truth. As young people, we are very exposed to what the world offers us, such as fashions, music, trends, attractments, and many other more deceptions that not only make us sin, but that also separates us from the eternal. Although they can look like they're harmless, but they can separate us from the eternal. Therefore, we must be very attentive and also maintain our communion with the Father, so that we are not dominated, and we can continue to enjoy that freedom to which we were called. Continuing with verses 22 through 29, they say, "You shall make for the breastpiece twisted chains like cords of pure gold, and you shall make for the breastpiece 2 rings of gold, and put the 2 rings on the 2 edges of the breastpiece, and you shall put the 2 cords of gold in the 2 rings at the edges of the breastpiece. The 2 ends of the 2 cords you shall attach to the 2 settings of filigree, and so attach it in front of the shoulder pieces of the ephod. You shall make 2 rings of gold and put them at the 2 ends of the breastpiece, and on its inside edge next to the ephod. And you shall make 2 rings of gold and attach them in front of the lower part of the ephod, and they shall bind the breastpiece by its rings to the rings of the ephod with a lace of blue, so that it may lie on the skillfully woven band of the ephod, so that the breastpiece shall not come loose from the ephod. So Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel in the breastpiece of judgment on his heart when he goes into the holy place, and bring them to regular remembrance before the Eternal." This portion tells us that the Eternal from the beginning had a perfectly united plan, where the image of the heavenly would be reflected on earth, since his intention was to dwell in the midst of humanity, using Israel as a light for the nations, since from them would be born the true light of the world, which is the Messiah, who descended from heaven in holiness, girded with truth and justice, under the covering of the Eternal to carry out his will. He carried Israel over his heart, being the good shepherd, who gave his life for his sheep, and included other sheep that were not from that fold, making both peoples one, breaking the barrier that separated them, since he gave the blessing to all, that opportunity to be a people for the Almighty and have intimate communion with him. For so many undeserved gifts that we have received, We cannot give any other response than obedience and holiness, being his imitators. In verse 30, we can read that it talks about the Urim and the Thummim, these two stones which the Eternal was going to use to give his verdict about what he would do with the 12 tribes of Israel, which contain a great teaching. The word Urim is referenced in the Strong Dictionary as Hebrews 224, which is the plural of Hebrews 215, or, which is to give light, clarify, and illuminate. So its meaning is lights, oracular brilliance of the figures in the pectoral of the high priest. This Urim refers to revelation, that light that descends from above to give us instructions on how we should live this life. The word Thummim comes from Hebrews 8550, which is the plural of Tom, which means complete, perfect, and righteous. So its meaning would be maturity. The Messiah came to bring the divine revelation. He is the light of the world, who made known the will of the Eternal, so that those who receive him could put the writing into action, or put the scriptures, the instructions, into action in their lives in the correct way, and become whole and become mature. In Colossians 1:9, verses 9 through 14, we can read that it says, "For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask Elohim to fill with the knowledge of his will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives." Here we can see the Urim, so that we may live a life worthy of the Eternal and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of Elohim, being strengthened with all power according to his splendorous might, so that he may have great endurance and patience, and giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. And here we can see the Thummim. An example that we can use, or that can be used, is that when we receive the Ruach, we have the Urim, since we possess the manifestation of the Eternal through Yeshua. That is, we are full of wisdom and understanding, not of this world, but spiritually, and that guides us to become perfected, firm, and complete. Once we have experienced this process, it is a sign that we are within the kingdom, which requires commitment and dedication on our part, since our goal is to be found in white garments, which are the just actions, and also to be found in faith until the coming of the Messiah. In the case of young people, we can do it by being diligent in the study in order to grow and put into practice what the scripture tells us, what they teach us, and any circumstance of our life is propitious for us to bear worthy fruits. Later on in these verses, the Eternal continues giving instructions about the mantle of the ephod, which should be blue with an opening in the middle for the head, and with a border around the waver's work, like the neck of a corselet, so that it does not break. And verses 33 to 35, they say, On its hem you shall make pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet yarns around its hem, with bells of gold between them, a golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate, around the hem of the robe. And it shall be on Aaron when he ministers, and its sound shall be heard when he goes into the holy place before the Eternal, and when he comes out, so that he does not die. And in these verses, we can see that it was necessary for Aaron to maintain strict care in all aspects. And although Aaron was, we can read here that although he was the grand minister, he was still human. He was still human being. He still had weaknesses like every single human being has, how we have them. And that's why his clothing had to sound to warn in advance that he was getting closer to the holy place, and that way he wouldn't die. From this portion we can also take applications. The cloak is a figure of the Messiah, both in its colors and in its workmanship. It is solid, without weakness, and unbreakable. Yeshua was without defect. That's why his delivery was enough to provide coverage. On the other hand, the bells that sounded on the edge of the tunic and the pomegranates represented the fruits of the Ruach that make our lives give a pleasant sound before the Eternal. Our fruits show our Heavenly Father who we truly are. As it says in Galatians 5:22 verses 22 and 23 that say, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." From verses 36 through 38 it says, "You shall make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it, like the engraving of the signet, holy to the Eternal. And you shall fasten it on the turban by a cord of blue. It shall be on the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead. And Aaron shall bear any guilt for the holy things that the people of Israel consecrate as their holy gifts. It shall regularly be on his forehead, and they may be accepted before the Eternal." We can see that the plaque on the forehead of the great minister represents that purity and holiness should be in his mind and in his understanding. And this teaches the people of Israel to be separated just as the Creator is. Yeshua also complied with this. He consecrated himself entirely to the Eternal. On the other hand, this portion shows us that the Eternal operates in our minds, carrying out a complete transformation in our life. When we receive his presence, our old way of living changes, and as the word says, now we have the mind of the Messiah. Our understanding goes renewing ourselves day by day, being separated, being consecrated, and remaining in his instruction. In 1 Corinthians 2:16 it says, "For who has understood the mind of the Eternal so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of the Messiah." Within these verses, it also reveals to us how the Messiah is the bearer of the name of the Almighty and of his authority. In him dwells the fullness of the deity, since his works were blameless. He is our best example to follow. His life exhorts us to seek the kingdom of Elohim and his justice, turning aside neither to the left nor to the right. As it says in Acts 4:12, "For the word of Elohim is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart." The last verses of this chapter 28 say, "Ye shall weave the coat in checker work of fine linen, and you shall make a turban of fine linen, and you shall make a sash embroidered with needlework. For Aaron's sons you shall make coats and sashes and caps. You shall make them for glory and beauty, and you shall put them on Aaron, on your brother Aaron and his sons with him, and shall anoint them and ordain them to consecrate them, that they may serve me as priests. You shall make for them linen undergarments to cover their naked flesh. They shall reach from the hips to the thighs, and they shall be on Aaron and his sons when they go into the tent for meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister in the holy place, lest they bear guilt and die. This shall be a statute forever for him and for his descendants after him." We can read that Aaron and his sons were anointed just as Yeshua, in which the Father deposited the fullness of his presence, and we believers also receive this anointing through Yeshua's delivery, which we must keep, living as true ministers of the kingdom who keep their garments clean. It is important that we should always examine ourselves and ask ourselves if we are truly living as ministers. On the other hand, here when the Eternal instructs Moses to make Aaron inner garments to cover his nakedness, we see that the word in Hebrew for naked is erva. This is an aspect that denotes that they were not perfect, but that thus, like us, they should strive to put on to put to death what is earthly. And another aspect that this portion shows us is that the service had to be carried out with modesty, which does not have to do with luxurious clothes, but with holiness. Once the Messiah has come, the prophetic time of this portion has already been fulfilled, since Yeshua now acts as the great minister who was anointed with the divine presence and made us participants of it. We have the opportunity to act as true ministers, since our nakedness, which refers to our sin, was covered, and we are now new creatures, made joint heirs of the kingdom, to live without contamination, separated from everything that leavens our lives, and focusing on the holy calling that we have. Continuing with chapter 29, we're going to see that it tells us about the consecration of the ministers. And like the previous chapter, it brings many applications for our lives. For through Yeshua, we have the call to depart to serve the Creator, and it is not just about being someone morally good, nor is it just putting the commandments into practice to comply, but doing it with understanding, focused on pleasing Him and carrying it out while different situations are happening around us, while there are opinions that differ from our faith, while there are adversities, while everything could be against us, and also when everything is going well in our lives, taking advantage of every moment to grow in our faith despite the circumstances that we can find ourselves in. The chapter begins with the instructions that the Eternal gives to consecrate Aaron and his sons as ministers. We can see that certain elements had to be offered, for example, a calf and 2 rams without defect, unleavened bread and unleavened cakes had to be made from fine flour with olive oil. The Eternal wanted Aaron and his sons to be completely dedicated to the ministry, to be separated from the people, which was a great responsibility, which would imply denying themselves and to dedicate themselves to the ministry and to the service of the Eternal. A commitment that not only they had to complete, but something that we also have to do. Our attention, our time, our effort must be focused at all times on serving the Eternal as ministers of his kingdom. And in order to be set apart, in order for the ministers to be set apart, they needed to purify themselves, because as human beings, they were not perfect. And for this reason is that the Almighty asks for a calf and 2 rams without defect, which speaks to us, and it teaches us of the purity and integrity that everything that is offered to the Eternal must have. For that, Yeshua was that perfect korban. He was that perfect sacrifice. Also, in the breads, cakes that had to be baked without yeast, they couldn't have yeast. That is, without sin and without hypocrisy. Just as they were going to be offered as sacrifices, the delivery of the ministers should be both those of that time and those of this time, but now through Yeshua, a sincere delivery with congruence and integrity to serve. Also, in this chapter, we can read that they had to wash themselves with water, and as we know, water represents the word of the Eternal, which cannot be missing in our life, since it produces that internal purification so that we walk worthy before the Eternal. Then the verses say that Aaron would dress and be anointed with the anointing oil, which would be poured out on his head, and this is an allusion to the Ruach of the Eternal, or the Spirit of the Eternal, which was poured out on the Messiah. And we can see this specifically as we see it in the Brit Hadashah when he made immersion with John the Baptist. The anointing oil was only on the things of the Mishkan, just as the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit, today is only on Yeshua and those who are a part of his consecration. We can read in these verses of chapter 29 that the Eternal commands Moses that Aaron's sons should be dressed in all their ministerial attire. And he also tells him that his ministry would pass on to the following generations by perpetual statute. We can see here that this does not necessarily mean that this ministry would be eternal, but it would only last for a specific time or a specific age. That is, it would have an end, and which ended up happening when the descendants of Aaron and his sons were lost millennium later. And also, when the Messiah made his delivery, he was appointed by the Eternal as the great minister, thus ending the Levitical ministry. He was appointed by the Eternal as the great minister, which was a shadow of what was to come, because as it says in the letter to the Hebrews, it was not perfect, because the blood of animals could not take away sins. A perfect korban, or a perfect sacrifice, was necessary, and that is why Yeshua came to complete this sacrifice. We also read that to consecrate them, the Eternal commanded them to make an offering for sin. And not only do we see an offering specifically for sin, but also a burnt offering, a consecration offering, an offering of the product of the wheat, and a peace offering. In the book of Leviticus, we are going to analyze deeper into these type of sacrifices or offerings that had to be made, and how, despite not being enforced or not being used nowadays, they still teach us the correct way to approach the Eternal, removing every type of sin from our lives to give ourselves completely as an olah, or as an offering in full consecration. We can also read that Aaron and his children, should only dedicate themselves to the Eternal, and he would be in charge of providing them with substance, or with food or whatever they needed through the offerings that the people brought for the Eternal. From there they would eat, and this was their portion ordered by the Almighty. In verses 29 through 30 of this chapter, it says, "The holy garments of Aaron shall be for his sons after him. They shall be anointed in them and ordained in them. The son who succeeds him as a priest, who comes into the tent of meeting to minister in the holy place, shall wear them 7 days." And well, in these verses, we can see how the ministry also consisted of those who were called to be ministers, instructing their children in the ministry, so that the following generations would be upright and continue to dedicate themselves to the service to the Creator, and as well consecrate themselves for the Creator. In these verses, we can see that the number 7 represents perfect, the complete, and thus the instruction shall be passed on to the following generations in an eternal way. Today, we as ministers of the kingdom also have to make more disciples for Yeshua, being a living testimony to all those around us, so that they also, if they want to, get closer and enter the kingdom. We read that Aaron and his sons could eat the meat of the animal that was used to consecrate them. So we must just as Aaron and his sons would take from these offerings, so must we take from Yeshua's delivery. But the question is, how can we do it? And well, we can do it by imitating him, by obeying his teachings. We must take his holiness, his justice, his obedience, and apply them to our lives. Verse 36 says, "And every day you shall offer a bull as a sin offering for atonement. Also you shall purify the altar when you make atonement for it, and shall anoint it to consecrate it." And we can see here that Aaron and his sons had to offer deliveries for 7 days to consecrate themselves completely. Today, those deliveries are not necessary, but because through the unique sacrifice of the Messiah, we can now get closer to the Father. But we are taught that as ministers, we must seek that complete consecration. And finishing with the last verses of this chapter 29, verses 44 through 46, it says, "I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. Aaron and his sons I will consecrate to serve me as priests. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their Elohim, and they shall know that I am the Eternal, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord." And in these last verses, we can see that the tent of reunion, or the tent of meeting, was the method for the Creator to be in the midst of his people. During that time, he was able to fulfill that desire in the midst of humanity, as it was in the beginning with Adam and Eve. But as we already know, this ministry was not perfect, and the sin still remained in them, which finally caused the Father to depart from them. But now, thanks to the work of Yeshua, the presence of the Creator lives in us, and thus he reigns in our lives. For this reason, we must dedicate everything we are to his service. We were bought at a high price, and we can no longer live guided by our desires or by the desires of our flesh, but we have to submit our carnality and allow the Ruach, the Spirit, to direct us, to guide us, to become that royal ministry that exalts the eternal with its works and that is light to those who are around us. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you for your time, and if you have any questions or any comments, you can leave them down in the comment section down below. Thank you and bye.